I know that I am in a very dangerous position being between you and dessert, so I'll try to keep that in mind and to stick to the time that I was allotted. You know, there's a story told about a Japanese visitor who spent the weekend at a Jewish friend's home, and he took him to services on Saturday morning, and he asked him about the significance of all the things, why they covered their eyes when they said the Shema, and he explained the concentration, why they bound at Modim, and he explained it. And when it came time for the sermon, the rabbi took off his watch and put it down. And he said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Not a damn thing." So, so today is a very important day. Today is May 15th. Which, as you know, is Israel's Independence Day. It's the secular date, even though we celebrate the Hebrew date as a rule. But today is the day, and I think it's something that should not pass unnoticed, that every opportunity we have to celebrate Israel, we should take advantage of, because there are a lot of people who are trying to deny it to us. And so all of us should remember and appreciate, and I will try to talk a little about it in a minute. I am really pleased to be here for many reasons. It's very special to me, not only because of the friends that I have here and my long personal association. I have been born and raised in Philadelphia, and I still call it my hometown, and I'm still a Phillies fan. And, you know, where you come from is very important in Jewish life. We see it so often in the Bible, where the story is told of where our forefathers and foremothers came from, not where they're going. God says, "El Eretz Ashareka," to the land that I will show you. But first you have to know where you're coming from in order to understand where you're going. And they tell the story of a man who was laying across 3 seats in the orchestra section of a theater, and a lady came to sit down, and she said, "Excuse me, you're laying across my seat." And the guy said, "Oi." He said, "Listen, you're laying on my seat. You got to get up." And he said, "Oi." Finally, she called the usher. The usher comes over and said, "You can't lay across the seats like that." And he said, "Oi." He said, "If you don't get up, I'm going to call a policeman." Finally, he has to call the cop. The cop comes down and looks at him and said, "Hey, you got to get up. You can't sprawl across the seats." And he said, "Oi." He said, "Okay, I'm going to have to arrest you. What's your name?" He said, "Max." He said, "And where are you from?" He said, "The balcony." So... So where you come from can be very important in determining where you're going. So being from Philadelphia was very determinant in where I ended up and the privileged life that I've had serving the Jewish people and much broader society. And I had a long association with the Kibbutz, both because my friends, and visited often and had many ties. And my belief is that there is nothing more important than Jewish education. And coming here to celebrate those who helped make Jewish education possible is the highest calling, to prepare our youth to meet the challenges and the opportunities that face them. It is the first priority of a Jewish community, even before building a synagogue, is to build a school. And that it is a collective responsibility that even those who don't have children of school age have an obligation to see to it that every child receives a Jewish education. To educate them, to be knowledgeable, to be confident as Jews, to defy the denigration and demonization of our heritage, of our history, to defend Israel against the demagogues and the demonizers, to proudly claim our affinity for the Jewish people here and abroad in the face of all of those who are trying to divide us and diminish us. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, more than 100 years ago, wrote that no generation is judged in its time. We're not even judged by our children. We're judged by our grandchildren. Because that's when you see truly come to fruition the decisions you make and the actions you take. We are who we are because of decisions our grandparents made as much as our parents. Our grandchildren and their grandchildren will be who they will be because of the decisions we make. We do not look at things in the traditional frame of time. Human beings are the only species that relates to a third generation. None others do, many to a children, but never to a third generation. It is what separates us. And we as Jews know that we cannot look at the moment. We need to look at it in the full context. I will tell you that the highest title and honor that anybody could have is Bubby and Zadie. And listening to you being referred to as such is the highest accolade and tribute. I wouldn't mind being adopted if you still have room, but you all, by your presence here today, by committing yourself, recognizing that we need to stand against the dangerous trends in America and around the world. Leaders like the Barrack family, whose benevolence and generosity and foresight and commitment have long been admired by me and many others. They have set such a high standard for others, which all recognize and you honor tonight. I am pleased to see the presence here of others who have received so much from them, including Dr. Englert, the president of Temple University, and Joanne Epps, the provost, and Greg Mandel, the dean of the Beasley School of Law at Temple University, from which not only did I receive a BA, but an honorary doctorate a few years ago, and which I proudly have hanging in the office at the Conference of Presidents. And to see Connie Smuckler, with whom I worked in the early days of the Soviet Jewry movement. When very few thought that Soviet Jews could be free, and we believed, and we overcame all of the obstacles. And thanks to the support at the time of the JCRC, for which I worked, and I see the Adlers here, both the president and CEO of the Federation, and welcome them. And I have to mention Angelica Berry, whose work I have long admired and whose foundation has done so much good, as did her late husband. And Sharon Levin, the president, the head of the school, and to Alex and your staff, and especially my good friend Rachel, you know, when she called and said, you know that you're speaking in Philadelphia, I said, I don't have it in my calendar. She said, now you do. And it's somebody whom I never would say no to because of all the amazing things that she has done and does, and all of your staff who've done really a remarkable job here tonight. So the people who are here represent the scope of your generosity and the impact that you have had and have been touched so many institutions and individuals. And in doing so, you have done so by putting Jewish education at the top of your priorities. Nothing could say more. And the same could be said of your dear friends, the Abramsons, who likewise have given so much of their lives to others, from the elderly and my own family, were benefits of that, to the students. I was present at the founding, at the invitation of Len, at the founding of the FDD, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, which has made such a major impact in Washington. You were and are both visionary philanthropists, and your affinity with one another is clearly understandable. So thank you to both of you, to all of you, and thank you for all that you have done, and seeing tonight is even more inspiring. We have much to be thankful for. My message tonight, I'm warning you now, is not a happy one. I was told to tell the truth. I always tell the truth. I know there are many people who heard me 20 years ago and 30 years ago when I warned about the danger of Islamic fundamentalism in the 80s, the danger of Iran in the 90s, and the danger of anti-Semitism in the 2000s. It isn't because we have more information than others. It's because we have Zechirah. Zechirah is remembrance. If you look at this period of the Jewish calendar, when we have so many holidays from Purim to Shavuot, in between, not only do we have the holiday of Passover, where Zechirah, remembrance, is the key commandment, that we remember the Exodus from Egypt. Because only when we remember the bitterness of slavery can we appreciate the sweetness of freedom. We remember on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, and the word chosen to embolize it wasn't revenge or avenge, it was zachor, remember. Because remembrance keeps their presence alive. The day we memorialized the 23,320 young people, mostly who gave their lives for the creation of the state, is Yom HaZikaron, a day of remembrance. Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron reminds us of the price we paid for a state. Yom HaShoah reminds us of the price of not having the state. And the same thing is true for all of the holidays. This one theme runs true. that we look back, but not to get lost in history. We look back in order to look forward, to learn the lessons so that we can spare future generations those trials and tribulations. Winston Churchill once said, the further back you will look, the further ahead you will see. Our sages said it 1,000 years earlier. They geared our holidays not just to be ritual observances, but to be experiential. We experience history. Zechirah is not history. There's no Hebrew word for history. Zechirah is a dynamic process where you look at what caused it and what flowed from it. If you're going to learn the lessons, you have to understand the dynamics of those things in order to be able to make sure that we see it, that we know how to recognize it, that we are able to make sure that future generations are not subjected to the same. We have to be able to see the warning signs, which too often we choose to ignore. I do a weekly radio show, as some of the people here said they listen to it, on John Batchelor on ABC Network every Monday and Thursday nights. If you don't listen, you're ashamed. But I know you all, that after this you all will. And he has a favorite saying whenever I come on, so many villains, so little time. And the truth is that right now we have so many things that are priorities for us. But they are because we care. You know, there was an epigenetics center at Harvard that did a study and spent $1 million on it, and the conclusion was that Jews have an extraordinarily high level of guilt. I could have saved them $1 million easily. But it's not true. It's not guilt. It's responsibility. The Jews have a high sense of responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for others as well. When the Copts and the Yazidis and the Kurds were in trouble, which was the community that spoke out? After the tsunami, what planes were landing behind foreign ministers with a mug and dove on them while they were saying, we won't take aid from Israel? The Prime Minister of Japan once said to me, why are Jews so influential? And I said, because Jews care, and people who care get involved, and people who get involved make a difference. People who don't get involved make no difference and have no influence. People invent all sorts of sinister plots and conspiracy theories. It is a conspiracy, I admit it. It's a conspiracy of love, of arevut, of responsibility for one another. That is very hard to explain to people. Why did we march for Soviet Jews when there were many people who were suffering, Baptists, others, in the Soviet Union? But nobody marched and nobody stood on Fifth Avenue in the rain and snow and the sleet. My parents came from Germany. And I remember a Russian cab driver driving me to a demonstration said to me, what are you doing there if your parents are from Germany? How was he to understand this sense of responsibility that we feel for one another? And it's especially true today when we see what's happening in regard to Iran and the dangers in the Gulf, but Iran's involvement in activities all over the world, and I won't go into it tonight, although I wish I could, because there cannot be a Jewish gathering that doesn't discuss it. That we see the 4 attempts to build empires in the Middle East to resurrect the days of old for an Ottoman Empire led by Erdogan, and expanding the Muslim Brotherhood influence and sending the message every Friday of what they can preach, building bases from Afghanistan to Syria. We have the Persian Empire being rebuilt by Khamenei, who similarly is building bases in Qatar and in the Sudan, all over Africa. I was there just recently, and it's the first issue every African leader raises with us is about Iran's growing influence and Turkey's attempts to compete. It is not what the media tells you. You know, Mark Twain once said, if you don't read a newspaper, you're ill-informed. If you read a newspaper, you're misinformed. It's even more so today. You cannot believe what you read. You can't believe what you hear. In fact, you can't believe what you see. So many distortions, so many misrepresentations. A cartoon in the New York Times that depicts Jews in a way that hardly anyone would believe in this age, and then justify it because it was a mistaken judgment. And then publishes another one 2 days later, equally offensive. To see pictures on the front page of children allegedly killed, and only last week about a mother and a baby supposedly killed by the Israeli bombs. And Israel said, we did not bomb and we did not hit civilians. And it turns out the Palestinian Islamic Jihad admitted it was they who killed it and paid her compensation. That one of their rockets that didn't cross the border, 90 of them, in fact, fell in Gaza and killed many of the civilians. And finally, they admitted that 80% of those killed were terrorists. Did you see that in the papers? Did you see the story of 6,000 Syrians treated in Israel? I went at 4 in the morning and saw young Israelis in the Golan crossing the border into Syria every single night to rescue Syrian children and bring them back to Israeli hospitals for treatment. More than 6,000 at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars absorbed by the government of Israel. Oh, you didn't read about it? The World Health Organization decided this year to condemn one country. Not Syria, not Libya, not Iran, not Lebanon, none of those who deny medical care, those who torture their own people, but the one country that built hospitals wherever there was a natural disaster or a need, or treated 50,000 people from Gaza and the West Bank, let alone the 6,000 from Syria. So we see that there are real distortions and misrepresentations at a time when these powers are trying to distort and create hegemony in the region. And it's the reason why so many Arab countries have changed their attitude. I visit all the Arab countries, and it is incredible to see how we're welcomed and how they talk about Israel. That during the war in Gaza, Saudi intellectuals came out in support of Israel. That no Arab country criticized Israel. That they're sick and tired of the kleptocracy into which they have poured billions of dollars in the so-called Palestinian Authority. And they tell us Israel is our only hope against the enemy, meaning Iran and the extremist forces. Believe me, they're flawed enough, these countries. But they recognize today that the source of stability, not instability in the Middle East, is that little country whose name hardly fits on the map. That is what's blocking the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, the Muslim Brotherhood Empire, and the Wahhabi Empire from dominating the region. So we have much to be proud of about Israel. Israel that is now energy independent, water independent, whose economy will grow by 3.5% this year. Iran's economy is going to shrink by 7.5% at the minimal. Inflation will be 60% with a population 10 times the size of Israel's. That Israel's tourism will see almost 5 million people, 150,000 from China, 100,000 from India, 70,000 from Muslim countries, including Indonesia and Malaysia, those countries that don't have relations with Israel, and many more secretly. That we see Israel that is a high-tech marvel to the world. That in Israel, to which African countries, and we were in Africa, as I said a few weeks ago, and all of them say, get us to Israel, get us to Israel, they have what we need. The Prime Minister visited there and met with 13 African leaders just last year, and the first trip to South America, to 4 South American countries. All of those who predicted the isolation of Israel, that if Israel stood by its rights, that they would be alone in the world. And look how the world is coming to Israel's doorstep. Israel's not perfect. It's not Disneyland. Sometimes it's Never Neverland, but it's not Disneyland. Israel lives in a real world and in a real neighborhood that is very troubling. But Israel is subjected to a campaign of vilification and demonization that is almost unparalleled, certainly in the last 70 years. And so I want to talk a little bit about the BDS campaign, but I think it's time to take the D out of BDS. The rest of you will get it later. Because BDS is not an economic war against Israel. BDS does not hurt Israel economically. Perhaps an individual factory. It hurts Palestinians massively. The mayor of Nablus called me in the middle of the night at home, and he said to me, you've got to stop this BDS. I said, me? I said, you stop it. You created it. You stop it. Because it's the Palestinian Authority that initiated it, that continues to fund it. The European Union gives $5.5 million to BDS campaigns and funds legal challenges to Israel to get it to an international criminal court. Switzerland gives $2 million. And I told the mayor, he said, but listen, these people are making equal pay with Israelis. They're coming back here, they will get less than 10% of it. They'll turn to terrorism. So I said, take the next bus to Ramallah, and you tell it to Mr. Abbas. But BDS is a tactic. It's a symptom. It's not the issue. You ask a BDS person on the campuses, in the communities, do you accept Israel in the 67 lines, not the current lines? They will say no. Ask them if they accept it in the 48 lines. They will say no, because they don't accept the right of Israel to exist. BDS is anti-Semitism. It's just a different guise. It's a way to make it acceptable. It is a way to make it palatable to so many, to deny us self-determination, a right they give to all others, to deny us a homeland, the ability to trade free of discrimination. It is anti-Semitism, clear and simple. It is an attack on the collective Jew, the corporate Jew, because even today it's not always politically correct, although increasingly so, to say I hate Jews. But it's okay to say that I hate Israel or I hate Zionists. We can't allow Zionism to become a pejorative. We have to draw the line. And so we see that Zionism becomes then the banner for hate. How they say, I hate Israel. I hate the collective Jew. They have no knowledge about Israel's history, the status, its significance, or what it does. And despite its appearance, BDS, economic impact is not the issue. As we saw, Fitch had just rated Israel to an A+ rating. And we saw a record number of $5 billion already invested in Israeli VCs. We see so many changes, and especially the increases in tourism and visits by heads of state who line up at Israel's door. There are so many indicators that show us that BDS does not have an economic impact on Israel, but a huge impact not only on Palestinians, but on the mood of young people and the attitudes on campuses. We face now initiatives across the country, constantly, every day, part of a pernicious and poisonous campaign of misinformation and disinformation, of extremists on the right and the left, of Islamists, of paid propagandists, manipulating the internet, exploiting the ignorance of our youth and others, and engaging in devastating campaigns, denying the truth, subverting it, intruding and tried to implicating those who would challenge them. Every day I come into my office and I have a list of the attacks of that day on Jews around the world. In most cases, BDS fails. It says so. The reports tell us it. But too often it succeeds, at least in the initial stages. And courageous students and university administrators who stand against the blatant lies and misrepresentations, the campaigns of bigotry, often funded by foreign sources. When the president of Cornell, of Williams College, Professor Hill of DePaul University, the president of Pfister College, these are courageous people in the last week stood up, even against their own students, the threats of their being dismissed, to say that they would not be part of this campaign of hate. But who would have believed that in the year 2019, Jewish students across the country would be afraid to wear a yarmulke, to wear a Star of David, to wear a T-shirt that expresses support for Israel on the quads of their campuses, to see AEPI houses under assault, to see professors who denigrate Jewish students publicly without price, to see Jewish faculty who stand up for Israel being isolated in their own campuses, to see the extremist voices, often those of faculty, dominating. BDS is something that is a symptom of a much larger event that is happening in our country and abroad. Sometimes distance gives us clarity, and we can see the events, for instance, in Europe, with much greater clarity. The fact is that I believe England is the model for the United States. I said it 10 years ago or 15 years ago in a major address that was on the internet for many years, in which I said that the BDS campaign will come to America and start like in England, amongst the academia, amongst the elites, amongst the political elites, amongst the creative class, and then filter down through society. Well, it is what has happened. And I believe that the same thing will be true in terms of the political posture here in the United States. That like Europe, we are losing the political center. We see the polarization and politicization of every issue virtually, but especially when it comes to Israel. Increasingly, we see intemperate views being accepted. We see the efforts of those who influence so many academics, entertainment figures, sports figures, media, engaging in this speech of hate. And we see it then permeating through society. This year, there was a 60% increase in anti-Semitic attacks in France, 70% in Germany. In New York City, there's already more attacks this year than all of last year. So this is not just a statement about the presence of hatred in our society. We read about it, and sometimes we react to anti-Semitism in Europe, and we express regret that yesterday a Jewish leader in Sweden was stabbed 9 times, a 60-year-old woman, that when we see the attacks on synagogues, but you know that in France, the vast majority of hate crimes were against Christian churches. 800 Christian churches were attacked last year in France. So this is not just a cancer that affects us. When people ask me, why should non-Jews be concerned, it's because they become the victims too. We may be the first, but we're never the last. And frankly, I'm tired of us being the canary in the mine. I'm tired of us being the barometer for society. I'm tired of the crocodile tears that are shed when Jews die. I don't want any more memorials for dead Jews. I want the world to stand up for living Jews and a living Jewish state without condition. When a congresswoman can say that the Arabs welcomed the Jews in the 1940s and gave them a safe haven, and it gives her warm feelings to talk about the Holocaust because of it, when in fact we know that the Arabs joined in marauding against the Jewish settlements, destroyed many, killed many, engaged in violent demonstrations to force the British into limiting immigration, and were allies of the Axis powers. The Mufti of Jerusalem sat in Berlin for 5 years. We see rewriting of history while the survivors are still alive. And then others, colleagues, rise to the defense. It's inexplicable. Ignorance, I can understand. I even understand hate. I cannot understand others rallying to the side when they talk about Jewish political involvement being about the Benjamins. Would we tolerate it about any other group? And these views permeate our campus too. Jews have the rights of every other people, and we cannot compromise them. We will not stand on the side. We will stand there and proudly stand against any of these forces. We will not let the bigots, the vicious anti-Semites, the hate mongers to gain traction. The internet is their best ally. The big lie still works when it comes to Jews. The difference from 80 years ago is that it takes seconds. It took Hitler months. They can spread a message around the world on tens of thousands of anti-Semitic websites. 70 years ago, the world said they didn't know. We know from the archives of the Allies that have been opened that they knew every day how many Jews were being killed. Every day, even before Operation Reinhardt, when 2,224,000 Jews were killed in Sobibor, Treblinka, Lublin, and 3 other camps. They knew a month before, but they didn't warn the Jews. They didn't even reveal it at Nuremberg. And I asked the Foreign Minister of England, why didn't you say it there? Because they wanted to protect the lie. It wasn't that they didn't know, they didn't want to know. And they were willing to let millions of Jews pay with their lives. Today, we know everything. There is no cloak of ignorance to hide our shame. And it is we who raise the bar on what we will tolerate. It is the good people whose silence allows the haters to gain credence. Martin Luther King once said, It's not the attacks of our enemies, but the silence of our friends, which will be determinant. Today we look at the world and look at the silence that we often see, and to see how many people are willing to tolerate and raise the level and raise the bar, dumbing deviancy down, as Senator Moynihan said. And I don't want anymore to hear people telling us, oh, we have to push tolerance. I don't want to be tolerated. I want us to be respected and accepted for who we are, for our values, our heritage, our legacy. You know that UNESCO has engaged in a campaign for the last 2 years in which they have first hyphenated the names of all the Jewish holy places, the Temple Mount, Rachel's tomb, the Cave of the Patriarchs, and they called it Haram al-Sharif. They named the wall, the Western Wall, Barrack's wall, named for Muhammad's horse, who ascended after him, supposedly from there. Kutab Rachel, for 3,000 years called Rachel's tomb, now known as the mosque for Muhammad's driver. And then the next year, last year, they dropped the hyphenation and only the Muslim names. So now in every UN document, 3,800 years of Jewish history wiped out, 2,000 years of Christian history wiped out. And your grandchildren, when they will want to visit these places, will be told, you have no right to. These are only Muslim holy places. The UN said so. And you think, what is it? Why would they do this? With all the problems, there isn't a single Arab country not at war with another Arab country. They all face new intifadas. They all face internal economic and other political problems. Why would they spend all this energy? Because they understand better than us that if you take away our past, you take away our future. If you cut off our roots, what right do we have to be there? What right do we have to be anywhere? That's why we look back. We look back to be strengthened, to understand who we are, where we came from. This is a time when all of us will be challenged in many ways. And it is why the primary responsibility is education. And our primary responsibility is Jewish education. Yesterday alone, there were anti-Semitic attacks in Virginia high schools, California high schools, and YouTubers of 14 years old engaging in the most blatant anti-Semitism and extremist ideology. Just on one day. There were attacks against Jewish students on university campuses across the country, and too often the universities did not do the right thing, did not stand up for their students, and they will pay the price ultimately for it. In San Francisco State University, we could not get a pro-Israel speaker, and finally we had to go to court. And a non-Jewish law firm spent $3 million preparing the lawsuit, and we went to court, and the first day the judge said to the university, look at the facts. How can you go into this trial? And they said, no, we're going to go ahead. And 2 hours into the trial, they turned to us and said, we want to settle, and gave everything. Across the country, Jewish students under assault. Jewish students do not feel safe. They are moving from university to university because they find it intolerable. Well, we will not allow the enablers and the facilitators of hate or the participants to escape responsibility. We will hold to account, no matter their position, all who tolerate or fail to prosecute hate crimes, those who allow them to walk off scot-free. We want to see that the guilty are held to account. We want more aid for schools to be able to protect themselves and Jewish institutions to have the proper kind of security. The community itself cannot afford it. We need the federal government and others, and we need a united effort to make sure that these efforts are going to be possible to get the additional funding. We can never take our freedoms for granted. We can't take our rights for granted, or ultimately we pay the price. And you know what the best answer to UNESCO is? The shovels that go in the ground in Jerusalem and all over Israel every single day to build a light railroad for an archaeological dig, to build a new building. Every single day. 20,000 artifacts a year. Millions that have been collected over the last 20 years. The names of the kings and the prophets on rocks. You can't argue with a rock. Your kids have doubts? show him it. Show him a menorah carved into a rock that somebody who visited the temple did. And when he sat down outside and he said, hey, I'm not schlepping this home, and threw it down so that we would find it 2,000 years later next to the golden bell from the priest's gown and a sword still in the scabbard of a Roman soldier who had gone down into the depths to go after the Jews who were trying to escape a burning Jerusalem. To see the tiles from the temple floor that my children in the sifting project found. You think anybody, any of them will ever have doubts in the future? Every single day there's a new discovery because God is telling us they have doubts. I want you to be assured, to be secure, to know who you are, where you come from, so that your children will know where they are going. Just as we judge a generation of 70 years ago, our grandchildren will judge us. And they will ask us, what did we do? Bobby and Zadie, you don't have to worry. You have a good answer to your grandchildren. But all of us have an obligation to make sure that we do. Stand up for those who stand against hatred and anti-Semitism. When J.K. Rowling stands up against anti-Semitism, when Madonna says she's going to the Eurovision no matter what, when the presidents of universities show the courage that each of them should have in standing against hatred, when Muhammad Ali, the head of the World Muslim League, joins us in a It Stops Now campaign and goes throughout the Arab world with a positive message, when the King of Morocco institutes Holocaust education, when Al-Sisi restores the Jewish holy sites in Egypt, stand up and praise them. Don't worry about the haters and the negative. Don't give them platforms and attention. Tell the story of the positive. Make them the model for our children and grandchildren. We need everybody. We can't afford Israel to become a polarized issue. We need Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. We need everyone. And therefore, all of us have to engage in that kind of an education campaign. That is the front line in our defense. Truth is our strongest weapon. And we have to inoculate our students. And I read all about the center and the curriculum you're establishing. It will affect not only Philadelphia, the whole country, because it will set a new standard, which I hope will be replicated. We do too little with kids who see the television reports, the criticisms, the distortions. What parent sits down with an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old and says, I want to explain to you what that's about? How many schools have classes that teach children at that age to understand what they're really seeing and what this really means? So you have the responsibility as a foremost educational institution that is setting the standards. We see in the studies how low the level of understanding of contemporary Israel is, even in our own community. Well, we have to make sure that that turns around. Because if not, when they get to campuses, they become victim of persuasive professors, of distorted accounts, that we have to stand together in common on our campuses and make sure that every Jewish student feels safe, that we will make sure that no one will be alone, and we will provide lawyers in defense, but more than that, the communities have to stand with them. In the Bible, it tells us, ask your parents, and they will tell you. Ask your grandparents, and they will explain it. Ask any Holocaust survivor that you know how they read the events of the last months and years. I've done it. And every one of them sees the blinking red lights. Every one of them says, this is the way. It begins with words, but it never ends there. Words of hate lead to deeds of hate. And it starts with demonizing and denigrating and dehumanizing. We all become vulnerable to it. So the difference from 70 years ago isn't that the world has changed. Hopefully we have changed. That we have learned the lessons of the past and our responsibilities to the future. The difference is that we have a Jewish state with a Jewish army and a Jewish navy and a Jewish air force. That when there are Jewish communities in distress in Ethiopia, in Iraq, in Iran, in Yemen, in Syria, in Russia, they could be saved. I had a privilege of being involved in all of those. And I can tell you that while we all can take credit, the fact is that it was the existence of a Jewish state that would take them and put its resources behind it that made it possible. No more Jews of silence. No more Jews who are kept silent. We have to make sure that informed young Jews will be able to stand up to the defamers and say no more. It stops now. There will be many allies, but only if we are on the forefront, just as was true in the Soviet Jewry movement and in movements for all others. And for those who think this is a negative message, you know, the prophets were often called prophets of doom. It's not true. They were prophets of hope. You just had to read the message right. What is depressing is ignorance. Knowledge is empowering. Knowing what the challenges are enables you to deal with them, to confront them, and meet our responsibilities to future generation. And I want to close by saying there is one precondition in all of Jewish history for every great miracle that has occurred to us, for every great success and the way to counter every challenge. And that's achdut, unity. When we stand together, there's nothing we can't accomplish. When we are pitted against each other, every challenge is too great. And if we stand together, others will join us. Others will stand with us. This week's Torah reading says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," that this is the core of Jewish life. The whole of Torah is summed up, that you love your neighbor like yourself. 36 times it says you have to love the stranger, because the Torah understands it's not always human nature, that you have to overcome the resistance. Well, we can have great pride in our past, in our history, in our traditions. This war against the Jewish faith, the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, the Jewish past, and the Jewish future will not succeed when you have institutions like the Barrack Academy and this new community center that you're building. We all have to support the schools and our institutions. We need forward-thinking approaches to assure that those future generations of leaders like the Barracks, who love Israel, who love Judaism, who love the Jewish people, are committed to a better society, and see our responsibility to the broader world, that we stand together. You know, when Noah built the ark, and he put hippopotami and elephants and everything on those planks of wood, he knew it couldn't support them. It's not possible. It was a miracle. So if God was doing the miracle already, frankly, why didn't he just build the ark? It would have saved a lot of time. The answer is God wants us to do our part. God is doing miracles for us every single day. Can anybody explain the existence of Israel as anything less than a miracle? Do you get up in the morning and say, is it still there when you give the array of weapons of nations, of threats against it? Do you think of what we have accomplished and where we stand in the world? The thing that distinguishes us from the generation of 70 years ago is that ours is the generation of miracles. The problem is we take them for granted, and then they don't continue. We have to step back and appreciate the miracles and make sure they continue for our children and grandchildren, to make sure that we protect them, that we build the kind of world that will assure them safety and security so that when they look back, they will praise you and they will thank you for making it a better world for them.